What if the greatest financial illusion of our time is happening right in front of you, quietly shrinking the national debt while most Americans believe nothing has changed? What if inflation, the very force people fear, is being used as a hidden lever to make trillions in debt simply evaporate without a single vote, headline, or public debate? The truth is unsettling because it forces you to rethink everything you thought you understood about money, value, and the invisible mechanics behind government solvency. And the more you follow the trail, the more one question keeps returning. How much of this was designed to happen without you noticing? For decades, Washington has faced a math problem no politician wants to explain. The U.S. owes more than $36 trillion, a figure so large it cannot realistically be repaid through taxation or spending cuts without triggering national shockwaves. Yet somehow, year after year, the burden of this debt feels strangely manageable. That is not an accident. It is the result of a strategy older than any modern policy debate, a method empires have used for centuries. Allow inflation to rise just enough to erode the real value of what they owe. Because when the purchasing power of the dollar falls, the real weight of old debt falls with it. 10 trillion borrowed years ago is not 10 trillion in today's weaker dollars. And that gap, that silent erosion of value, is the government's most reliable escape hatch. But this raises a deeper mystery. If inflation destroys household budgets, why would the government rely on it? Because inflation hurts individuals immediately, while it helps the state gradually, almost invisibly. Your savings lose value, your paycheck stretches less, but the government's old debts shrink in real terms, becoming easier to service with every percentage point of rising prices. And here is where things turn even more interesting. Inflation alone is powerful, but paired with strategic bond buybacks, it becomes a surgical instrument. When the government repurchases its own bonds after inflation has weakened the currency, it is effectively buying back obligations at a discount without ever admitting that this discount exists. Most people never connect these dots because the process is framed as ordinary fiscal management. Yet behind that calm facade lies a mechanism that quietly shifts trillions away from creditors and toward the state. And once you understand this, you cannot unsee it. The debt is not being paid down as much as it is being dissolved through a slow chemical reaction between inflation, bond markets, and public ignorance. Have you ever felt like the numbers never quite add up? You are not alone. Share your thoughts in the comments, leave a like if this opened your eyes, and make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss what comes next. Because the next piece of this story reveals why the government depends on this system far more than it admits, and why the real cost is paid by ordinary citizens without them ever realizing it. The deeper you follow this trail, the clearer it becomes that inflation is not simply an economic side effect. It is a strategic instrument, a pressure valve the government relies on whenever the gap between what it owes and what it can realistically repay becomes impossible to ignore. And the key to understanding this lies in one uncomfortable truth. The U.S. does not need to eliminate its debt. It only needs to make that debt smaller in real terms, shrinking it quietly while the public focuses on wages, prices, and elections. Once you see this, the entire system looks different, almost as if economic policy has two layers, one for public consumption and one designed to manage long-term obligations that cannot be openly addressed. When inflation rises, every dollar borrowed in the past loses purchasing power. Debt issued 10 or 20 years ago was priced in stronger dollars that could buy more goods, more labor, more global influence than today's diluted currency. So when the government services that old debt using weaker dollars, it is effectively paying less than it originally owed. This is the hidden loophole built into every fiat currency system. Because when money is not tied to gold or any fixed standard, its value becomes a tool, something policymakers can stretch or compress to navigate crises without ever admitting they are reshaping the economic foundation beneath the public's feet. But inflation alone is not enough. It must be calibrated, guided, kept within a range that weakens old debt without triggering panic. Too little inflation and the debt remains heavy. Too much, and markets start anticipating loss of control, demanding higher interest rates that make borrowing even more expensive. This is why the Federal Reserve speaks obsessively about expectations. They are not only trying to guide markets, they are trying to maintain an illusion of stability, while quietly allowing just enough erosion to make the future less burdensome for the Treasury. This creates a strange contradiction. The government publicly vows to fight inflation, yet it benefits enormously from letting inflation run slightly hot. Higher price levels generate higher nominal tax revenue without raising tax rates. Meanwhile, the real value of outstanding debt keeps sliding downward, almost like a slow melt beneath the surface of the financial system. It is a balancing act that requires precision, messaging discipline, and the hope that the public never fully understands how the pieces fit together. And while most people focus on the rising cost of groceries or housing, They rarely realize that those same rising prices are part of a broader mechanism designed to soften the weight of commitments made decades ago. This is why the policy conversation always feels incomplete, as if something essential is being left unsaid, because the real story is not about inflation itself, but about why it is allowed to persist and who truly benefits from its silent arithmetic. Once you recognize that inflation reduces the real weight of old obligations, the next layer becomes even more revealing because the government does not rely on inflation alone. It pairs inflation with intentional monetary expansion, creating cycles that reshape the financial landscape without ever requiring a formal announcement. Expansion of the money supply is often discussed as a response to recessions or crises, but its long-term effect is far more subtle. By expanding liquidity, the Federal Reserve increases the number of weaker dollars circulating through the system, and when those weaker dollars are used to repay older debts, the economic reality changes even if the nominal figures remain the same. What looks like stability from a distance is actually a controlled dilution happening in slow motion. This is where the strategy gains depth. When the Fed injects liquidity through asset purchases or emergency lending programs, it is not simply supporting markets. It is reinforcing a long-term pattern that gradually shifts the financial burden away from the state. More dollars in circulation mean the value of each dollar decreases relative to past periods, so the trillions borrowed in earlier decades become easier to manage. Not because the economy became more productive, but because the yardstick used to measure that debt has been quietly recalibrated. This mechanism is not accidental. It mirrors techniques used by empires throughout history, whether through debasement of coinage or redefinition of currency standards. The method changes, the logic does not. But monetary expansion comes with a psychological twist. People understand debt in nominal terms. If the government owes 10 trillion, it owes 10 trillion. That number does not change on paper. What changes is the value of the money used to repay it. This disconnect between nominal debt and real debt is the heart of the strategy. Policymakers know that public attention follows the headline number, not the hidden math underneath. So as liquidity increases and the currency gradually weakens, the real burden of servicing old obligations quietly falls. Meanwhile, rising asset prices give the appearance of economic strength, masking the underlying dilution. This is why periods of aggressive monetary expansion often coincide with narratives of growth, recovery, or modernization. The public sees their home values rise, their stock portfolios increase, their retirement accounts climb. Few stop to question whether these gains reflect real productivity or simply the inflationary side effects of expanded liquidity. And all the while, the government benefits from paying yesterday's debts with today's softer currency, moving step by step through a pattern that appears cyclical but is in fact deeply intentional. As the system shifts, you begin to notice how each phase prepares the ground for the next, setting up the conditions that allow inflation to work hand in hand with mechanisms that seem unrelated at first glance, but ultimately shape the same silent outcome. As the cycle of monetary expansion unfolds, another mechanism begins operating quietly in the background, one that rarely makes headlines, yet plays a decisive role in reshaping the true burden of national debt. Bond buybacks, often framed as technical adjustments or liquidity operations, carry an influence far greater than their official descriptions suggest. When the government or central bank buys back its own bonds, especially during periods of elevated inflation, the transaction does far more than stabilize markets. It enables the state to retire obligations using currency that has already been weakened by earlier policy choices, turning time itself into a financial advantage. The original creditors are paid in full nominal terms, but the purchasing power behind those terms has shifted, creating a discount, hidden inside the appearance of repayment. This mechanism becomes even clearer when considering yield manipulation. By influencing interest rates through policy signals or direct market activity, the Federal Reserve shapes the cost at which the government borrows new money and the value at which old bonds trade. Lower yields make existing bonds more expensive, but in a high inflation environment, the real return to investors can become negative even when nominal payments continue unchanged. This negative real yield is one of the most powerful tools in the government's arsenal, because it reduces the real value of what it owes while maintaining the fiction of stability. Investors technically receive their interest, but when inflation outpaces that interest, the government is effectively paying back less than it borrowed. Seen from another angle, buybacks also serve a deeper psychological purpose. They project confidence, suggesting that the government is managing its balance sheet proactively. Yet beneath that veneer lies a far more strategic calculus. When the state repurchases debt during periods of currency erosion, it locks in the benefits of inflation before conditions shift again. Each buyback becomes a financial timestamp, capturing a moment when the government can retire past commitments at a fraction of their original real cost. And because this happens through routine financial channels, The public rarely understands the significance of these moves. To most people, a buyback is a footnote, not a signal. What makes this even more striking is how predictable the pattern becomes once you learn to read it. Inflation rises, yields adjust, buybacks occur, and the debt load silently shrinks in real terms while appearing stable on paper. It is a cycle that reinforces itself, one that rewards policymakers for relying on subtle erosion instead of difficult reforms. If you have noticed similar patterns or experienced the effects of these silent shifts in your own financial life, share your perspective in the comments, because understanding how these mechanisms interplay is the first step toward recognizing how deeply they shape the system around us. Once you see how bond buybacks quietly reshape the government's balance sheet, the next question becomes unavoidable. If the state benefits so much from this hidden erosion, who ends up carrying the cost? The answer reveals a divide far deeper than most economic debates acknowledge. Because every time inflation rises faster than returns on savings or investments, wealth shifts from the public to the government. And this transfer does not happen evenly. It strikes different groups with different intensities, creating winners and losers in a system that appears neutral on the surface, but is anything but. For ordinary households, inflation works like a silent tax. Savings lose purchasing power even when the nominal balance stays the same. Fixed income earners feel the pressure first, as their paychecks fail to keep pace with rising costs. The slow erosion is easy to ignore in the early stages, but as time passes, it reshapes what people can afford, how they plan, and what future they imagine for themselves. This erosion accumulates quietly, often without a single moment dramatic enough to trigger alarm, because the changes happen inch by inch rather than all at once. Investors, especially those holding long-term bonds, face a different kind of loss. When inflation consistently outpaces the interest rates on those bonds, their real returns turn negative. On paper, they receive interest exactly as promised. In reality, the money they get back buys less each year. The government meets its obligations, but the investor absorbs the gap between nominal payment and real value. This is the hidden trade-off embedded into the structure of the bond market. The state does not need to default if it can repay in money that has quietly weakened over time. Banks and large financial institutions, however, operate under an entirely different dynamic. While they also face the effects of inflation, they often benefit from the environment that inflation creates. Rising asset prices buoy portfolios, increased lending demand boosts profits, and access to liquidity through central bank mechanisms gives them a cushion unavailable to the average citizen. For these institutions, inflation is less a threat and more a field of opportunity, especially when combined with the predictable rhythm of government policy. And then there is the federal government itself, the sole player capable of shaping the currency while also owing debt denominated in that same currency. For the state, inflation is not a disruption, it is leverage. It reduces the real value of past obligations and inflates nominal tax revenues, making future commitments more manageable. The asymmetry is stark, and once understood, it becomes clear why these cycles persist across decades under administrations of every political persuasion. The system is built in a way that rewards erosion over confrontation, gradual weakening over explicit correction, leaving the public to feel the symptoms without ever being told the underlying cause. As you trace these imbalances, another layer emerges, one that reveals just how intentionally inflation is woven into the architecture of modern governance. Inflation is not simply tolerated, it is engineered, moderated, and deployed as a structural tool to recalibrate obligations that would be politically impossible to confront directly. When the government faces debt so large that repayment through traditional means would trigger social upheaval, inflation provides a quieter, softer alternative. It does what legislation cannot do publicly. It reduces real liabilities without ever admitting that anything has been reduced. This is why economists often refer to inflation as a policy choice disguised as an economic outcome. It offers a way to reset financial burdens without triggering the panic associated with explicit austerity. When public debt grows faster than economic output, policymakers face a crossroads. They can cut spending and raise taxes, steps that carry immediate political penalties, or they can allow inflation to run slightly above expectations, letting time and rising prices erode the real value of what the state owes. History shows that governments almost always choose erosion over confrontation because erosion feels invisible. It happens in the background, absorbed by millions of dispersed households rather than concentrated on any single political decision. But inflation's usefulness goes even deeper. It allows governments to preserve the appearance of honoring commitments. Social programs, pension obligations, and bond payments continue nominally unchanged, creating the illusion of stability. Yet the purchasing power behind those payments steadily dissolves. The system maintains its structure while quietly hollowing out its substance. This duality is what makes inflation such a powerful political tool. It enables leaders to claim fiscal responsibility while relying on mechanisms that quietly dilute the cost of their promises. This pattern becomes even more visible when you consider how inflation interacts with long-term projections. Governments often estimate future liabilities using expected growth, expected tax revenue, and expected price levels. When inflation rises above projections, nominal revenues increase automatically. Even if real economic activity remains flat, the numbers look healthier on paper. The gap between appearance and reality widens, but the public rarely sees the difference because the official metrics respond more to price levels than to underlying productivity. This is why inflation becomes a structural pillar rather than an accidental outcome. It cushions the impact of decades of accumulated obligations, allowing the government to stretch the timeline of solvency far beyond what would be possible under stable currency conditions. And the longer this pattern continues, the more normalized it becomes, embedding itself in public expectations, institutional behavior, and policy-making assumptions. At some point, inflation is no longer perceived as a deviation, but as the baseline around which everything else must adapt. As inflation becomes a structural pillar rather than a temporary disturbance, the role of bond repurchases reveals an even more intricate layer of strategy. Buybacks do not simply retire old debt. They reshape expectations. Every time the government re-enters the market to acquire its own obligations, investors receive a signal about direction and intent. But beneath that surface message lies a deeper distortion, one that bends the bond market around the priorities of the state rather than the natural forces of supply and demand. When a government with immense monetary power steps in as both borrower and buyer, normal price discovery becomes blurred. Yields no longer reflect pure market sentiment. They reflect a carefully curated environment designed to keep the system stable while quietly eroding the real value of what is owed. This distortion becomes clearest during periods of aggressive liquidity injection. When the central bank purchases large quantities of government securities, yields are artificially pushed downward, making borrowing seem cheaper than it truly is. Investors see stability, but that stability is engineered. Low yields mask the underlying risk that inflation is eroding real returns. And for the government, this environment creates a window of opportunity. In real terms, the cost of servicing old debt shrinks, while the ability to issue new debt becomes easier, even if the fundamentals do not justify such favorable conditions. It is a cycle built not on market health, but on carefully maintained perception. Bond buybacks also serve as a form of narrative control. They allow policymakers to claim fiscal prudence without addressing the underlying imbalances. The public hears that the government is reducing its debt. What they are not told is that the value of the currency being used to repurchase that debt has already absorbed much of the real cost. The state appears responsible, but the heavy lifting is done by the silent erosion of monetary value, rather than by disciplined budgeting. It is a performance of stability rather than a demonstration of it. Over time, these patterns shape how markets behave. Investors learn to anticipate intervention. Asset prices adjust around expectations of future buybacks or liquidity waves. And as markets internalize these rhythms, the distance between reality and perception grows. What looks sustainable from afar may be resting on foundations that are far more fragile than they appear. If you have ever noticed how these cycles repeat with uncanny precision, or wondered how much of market behavior is organic versus orchestrated, share your thoughts in the comments, because recognizing these distortions is the first step toward understanding the deeper structure beneath today's financial landscape. As these financial distortions deepen, another question begins to surface. If the mechanics are so powerful, so repetitive, and so strategically beneficial to the state, why does the general public rarely notice what is happening? The answer lies not in secrecy, but in psychology. Most people do not track the real value of money. They track prices. They track wages. They track the day-to-day pressures of their own financial lives. Inflation, by design or by consequence, hides its true impact behind these moving targets, turning a complex macroeconomic process into a series of personal frustrations that feel disconnected from government policy. The system relies on this disconnect. It transforms a collective loss of purchasing power into millions of individual stories, each one interpreted as a personal challenge rather than a structural outcome. This psychological fog is reinforced by the way inflation is presented publicly. Government officials often describe rising prices as temporary, transitory, or external, framing them as disruptions rather than signals of an underlying pattern. The narrative is always forward-looking, promising stabilization somewhere ahead. This creates a subtle mental anchor. People expect inflation to return to normal, even when normal has shifted permanently. As long as inflation is framed as a momentary inconvenience rather than a long-term mechanism, the deeper implications remain hidden in plain sight. Another reason the public rarely grasps the connection between inflation and government debt is that nominal values dominate the conversation. Wages rise in dollars, savings accounts show dollar balances, debt payments are expressed in dollars. Because everything is denominated in the same unit, the slow erosion of that unit's purchasing power is difficult to perceive without stepping back. Even when people notice rising prices, they rarely map that experience onto the government's balance sheet. The mental gap between household economics and federal policy is wide enough to obscure the link completely. This illusion is strengthened by how markets behave during inflationary cycles. Rising asset prices give the impression of wealth accumulation, even when that wealth is largely nominal. Homeowners see property values climb, stock investors watch their portfolios expand, and businesses report higher revenues. The psychological reinforcement is powerful. If the numbers are going up, things must be improving. Yet beneath that apparent prosperity lies the same erosion that reshapes the government's debt burden. The public feels richer while their currency becomes weaker, and the contradiction rarely becomes clear until much later, when the consequences are already embedded in the system. In this way, the population becomes an unintentional participant in a process they do not fully understand, responding to visible symptoms rather than the invisible forces driving them. The illusion persists because it feels normal, familiar, and consistent with what people expect from a modern economy, even when those expectations are being shaped by forces operating far beyond their daily view. When you zoom out from the present and examine history through a wider lens, the pattern becomes even more familiar. What the United States is doing today with inflation, controlled monetary expansion, and subtle debt erosion is not new. It is a modern expression of an ancient strategy used by empires that found themselves burdened by obligations too large to confront openly. Throughout history, powerful states have relied on quiet adjustments to the value of their currency whenever their debts grew faster than their ability to generate real economic output. The tools change across eras, but the motivation remains constant: preserve stability without admitting vulnerability. In ancient Rome, emperors repeatedly debased silver coins, reducing their metal content while maintaining their nominal value. Citizens saw the same coins circulating, unaware that each iteration carried less real worth. Over time, the empire effectively paid its soldiers, suppliers, and creditors with diluted currency, softening the true cost of its financial commitments. What appeared to be responsible stewardship was, in reality, an early form of inflation engineering. The public reacted to rising prices, but few understood why those prices were rising in the first place. Centuries later, European monarchies, facing war debts and territorial expenses, leaned on similar tactics. Instead of openly defaulting, they altered weight standards, reissued coins, or adjusted ledger values behind closed doors. The public narrative remained one of stability and strength, while the economic foundation underneath was slowly rebalanced through erosion, rather than direct confrontation. These adjustments bought time, delayed crises, and allowed governments to maintain the appearance of solvency even when their true fiscal position had weakened considerably. Modern nations no longer rely on metal content to manipulate value. They rely on central banks, interest rate policies, liquidity programs, and sophisticated messaging strategies to guide expectations. Yet the underlying mechanism is identical. When a government controls the currency in which its debt is denominated, it possesses a unique power, the ability to change the real cost of its obligations without altering the nominal figures. This power is rarely discussed openly because acknowledging it would expose how deeply dependent the system is on public misunderstanding. As you examine historical cycles, a striking consistency appears. Empires rarely collapse because their debts are too large. They collapse when their attempts to manage those debts break down. Quiet erosion works until it does not. Controlled inflation remains controlled until confidence falters. Once citizens begin to question the value of the currency itself, the mechanism that once stabilized the system becomes the accelerant of instability. And while history never repeats in the same form, it echoes with enough clarity to reveal that the forces shaping today's economic landscape have been at work for centuries, silently guiding nations toward crossroads they often fail to recognize until the moment of reckoning is already underway. As these historical echoes grow louder, the final piece of the pattern becomes clear: debt erosion, controlled inflation, strategic buybacks, manipulated yields. These tactics form a system that functions smoothly only as long as confidence remains intact. Confidence is the invisible currency that underpins every modern economy. It determines how people interpret rising prices, how investors react to shifting yields, and how foreign creditors assess long-term risk. When confidence holds, the illusion works. Money retains its social meaning. Markets continue to behave as expected. Governments operate as though their strategies are simply stewardship rather than delicate balancing acts. But when confidence begins to slide, even slightly, the entire structure becomes more fragile than it first appears. What makes the current moment so critical is the scale at which these mechanisms now operate. Never before has an economy as large as the United States relied so heavily on a combination of inflation management and financial engineering to maintain the viability of obligations expanding into tens of trillions. The larger the system grows, the more pressure it places on the mechanisms designed to stabilize it. Inflation must be contained but not eliminated. Bond markets must respond smoothly but not independently. Investor psychology must remain predictable without revealing how much of that predictability is orchestrated. The balancing act becomes tighter with every cycle, even as the narrative presented to the public remains calm and familiar. And this brings us to the most revealing truth. Systems like this do not break because of a single event. They break when layers of assumptions begin to shift, when investors start demanding higher yields not because of policy changes, but because they sense that erosion has become structural rather than strategic, when foreign creditors diversify not for profit but for protection, when households begin noticing that their real wages no longer align with their expectations of stability. These changes happen slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, before accelerating in ways that reshape the entire economic landscape. That is the moment history warns about, the moment when the illusion of control becomes more difficult to maintain than the reality behind it. If you have followed this journey to the end, it means you are thinking beyond headlines and into the deeper structure that shapes nations and markets. Share your perspective in the comments using the phrase, "This message was for me, so I know you stayed with me until the final insight." And if this breakdown helped you see the system with clearer eyes, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next investigation into the patterns guiding global power. Leave a like to strengthen the conversation we are building here, and when you're ready, there's another video waiting that expands this discussion even further. Click and continue with me, because the next layer reveals connections most people never realize exist until the consequences are already unfolding.